The story of S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 is filled with many interesting characters, each with their own motivations and ideals. However, the one that stands out the most as being more mysterious and mystical is Faust, the voice of the Monolith. In this video, we will embark on a journey to figure out Faust's character on a deeper level, investigating his origins, his beliefs, and trying to figure out his plans. Huge spoilers ahead, and buckle up because we're in for quite the ride. After the Monolith contraption was turned off, the stalkers under its influence started to wake up from their fanatical brainwashing. Suffering from memory loss, the former Monolithians couldn't remember who they were. Scattered, lost and confused, many of them died at the hands of the other factions who had not forgotten the horrible actions committed by the people of the Monolith. Once a valuable Monolithian marksman, S.T.A.L.K.E.R decided to find a new way of life and clear his brothers' names. For this purpose, he formed a Noontide and established a shelter on Wild Island, welcoming all former fanatics by his side. Faust was among the first to join S.T.A.L.K.E.R in his quest. However, the two men had very different views on the situation and on what to do for the future. S.T.A.L.K.E.R believed they should move on from their past, accept that the Monolith was just a trick of the mind, and reject it. He instead advocated for his brothers to build a new life for themselves. In order to prove his good intentions to the other factions, and that Noontide was not the Monolith anymore, S.T.A.L.K.E.R signed the peace treaty established by the Ward, and took upon the goal of cleaning up the zone of its toxic waste. Under his supervision, the old decontamination facilities on Wild Island were slowly being put back in service, and the Noontiders worked hard in difficult conditions to store, process and secure the dangerous chemicals. They even had a partnership with Professor Lodochka, a scientist working on new ways to convert the trash of the zone into something useful. The main project involved producing electricity via the chemicals, a very promising endeavor with huge potential to secure a brighter future for Noontide. On the other hand, Faust wished to return to the Monolith days. Unlike most of his brothers, he had not forgotten the voice of the Monolith, and the happiness it brought them. Faust would thus organize sermons to rally the other Noontiders to his cause. One of his most effective arguments against the path chosen by S.T.A.L.K.E.R was the awful nature of the jobs at Wild Island. Working in the waste processing facilities was slowly taking a toll on the men, who were often exposed to toxic fumes and other deadly hazards. S.T.A.L.K.E.R hated that Faust was preaching to embrace the old ways of the Monolith, but he still allowed it, because he thought everyone should be free to follow their own path. Therefore, Faust exploited S.T.A.L.K.E.R's hospitality, scheming behind his back for many years before putting his grand plan in action. A plan that had one purpose: to bring back the Monolith. To achieve this goal, Faust would put his special abilities to good use. On the surface, he appeared as a charismatic man, able to convince with the power of speech. The fact that he could manage in the zone while being blind added a lot to his mystical allure. However, it turns out that Faust was not just any Monolithian. He was the so-called Voice of the Monolith, a title that portends a dark secret hidden within the deep confines of the Agroprom underground. There lies one of the zone's old laboratories, codenamed X5, inside of which experiments on mind control and mutants were performed. The facility was involved in various interesting research programs. For example, Project Leash was an attempt to control mutated creatures via special colors in order to use them as expendable soldiers. Then there was the Controller Project, which most certainly resulted in the creation of the Controller mutant. Professor Dvupalov The main scientist in charge of these affairs believed that the controller was actually a failure because the test subjects had become monsters, devoid of human emotions. He thought their psi abilities were pitiful without an intact human brain still in charge, and he's got a point. Controllers might be able to zombify people, but they are quite dumb and predictable. After the anomalous zone was born, Project X was officially shut down, but the MDST took over the X laboratories and offered the scientists working there the opportunity to keep their jobs. Some accepted and continued the research to the profit of the Sea consciousness and its allies, while others refused and resigned. Dvoupalov was among those who left, but his colleagues who remained in X5 picked his projects up and decided to make his idea of a more human controller a reality. The details of how they managed to pull it off are unknown, but the result was all the same. Faust, very much like a human, but also gifted with powerful psi abilities. In one of his dialogues, Faust implies that he was once a normal stalker who came to the Duga, but he made a mistake, one wrong step, and paid the price by losing his eyesight. Perhaps this is when he was captured and turned into a test subject. There is also the theory this is simply the memory of another stalker that was implemented in his brain, while Faust's body would have been grown artificially, but there is not enough information to know for sure how he came to be. Furthermore, the recording of a session between Dvoupalov and a particular test subject, most likely Faust, can be found in X5. Unfortunately, the recording is incomplete, as only Dvoupalov can be heard, but what he says is pretty interesting. Indeed, the professor insists on the fact that abstract thinking is what separates us from mutants, and intends to present his test subject with metaphors and poetry. This could explain part of Faust's personality. Moreover, it seems to confirm that Dvoupalov had already started to work on Faust before he left Project X, which is corroborated by Dvoupalov's reaction to Faust's actions during the events of the game. Other documents from X5 confirmed that Dvoupalov's critiques of the controller project were correct, and recognized by his successors, who completed Faust's conversion. They connected him to the Monolith network, transforming him into a true leader for the Monolith faction. The process was highly successful, and just like Dvoupalov had intended, Faust preferred to utilize subtlety and ingenuity to inspire his fighters, rather than relying on his brainwashing powers. He also gained abilities beyond those of a normal controller, such as being able to see through the noosphere via the so-called subtle world, but also creating realistic hallucinations, casting phantom copies of himself, and so on. Before moving on to Faust's plan, I quickly want to touch on the figure of Faust in history and literature. Indeed, Faust is a pretty famous character, appearing in various books and stories over the centuries, and apparently inspired by a very real person, Georg Faust. Due to this popularity, there are many versions of Faust with different characteristics, but he is often depicted as some sort of dark magician, able to instigate both fascination and disgust due to his fantastical but unnatural abilities. This duality echoes to the Faust we are discussing in this video, a strongly divisive figure for Noontiders. Moreover, the most widespread version of the myth presents Faust as an alchemist, a scientist whose quest for knowledge and happiness would lead him to sell his soul to the devil. In a way, this reminds of our Faust's decision to trade freedom for purpose by bringing back the Monolith. That being said, how did he manage to do it? Let's take a closer look at his plan during the events of S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2. The game takes place in the summer of 2021, 9 years after the Monolith went silent. Old recordings revealed that back then, Faust became desperate, as he was deeply traumatized by the loss of his beloved entity. However, he learned about S.T.A.L.K.E.R, who was gathering former Monolithians, and decided to join in order to reconnect with his brothers. During the span of all these years, Faust schemed behind S.T.A.L.K.E.R's back, slowly putting in place the pieces of his plan. His preparations included gathering followers within Noontide, collecting old Monolith technologies, and even spreading his influence further by infiltrating other factions. Firstly, Faust often gave sermons to his brothers, preaching about the happiness that the Monolith once brought them. While S.T.A.L.K.E.R was aware of these speeches, what he did not know is that Faust had converted some of his closest friends, who were pretending to be on S.T.A.L.K.E.R's side while working for Faust in the shadows. For instance, Foma was part of S.T.A.L.K.E.R's original squad back in the times of Call of Pripyat, and yet he became one of Faust's most important sidekicks. In any case, ensuring the loyalty to a significant number of Noontiders gave Faust enough manpower to make the necessary preparations for the execution of his plan. Which leads us to his next trick, to collect Monolith technologies and devices. Indeed, S.T.A.L.K.E.R wanted Noontide to cut all ties with their past, and thus he rejected old Monolith tech, such as Psi-Emitters, regenerators, and even Gauss rifles. This gave Faust the perfect opportunity to search for and gather these devices for himself. We can imagine that his followers checked on former Monolith stashes, raided secret facilities, and used the black market to get their hands on a large supply of Monolith equipment. S.T.A.L.K.E.R, who was an expert at uncovering and smuggling old Project X technologies, was the one who provided Faust with a number of Psi-Emitters that would be of crucial importance to his plan. The stuff was carefully hidden in caches, lying in wait for the right moment to be unearthed again. Meanwhile, Faust's influence was spreading even beyond Noontide, as he started to infiltrate other factions via his minions. In some cases, sleeper agents were used in the form of ex-Monolith fighters that nobody suspected. The most striking example is Captain Sukin, the military commander of the S.T.A.L.K.E.R, who turned out to be a former Monolithian and another pawn of Faust. Then there were also people from other factions who simply fell under Faust's manipulation spell. One of them was Lieutenant S.T.A.L.K.E.R of the Ward, who became a mole within the Warden ranks. S.T.A.L.K.E.R's journal revealed that he was initially skeptical about Faust, but he was eventually seduced by the promise of true happiness. After acquiring both the men and the resources, Faust moved on to the last phase of his preparations that aimed at bringing back the Monolith via an event called the Signal. That would be the moment when the X network comes back online, emitting on a specific Psi frequency that, when transmitted by Psi devices, would restart the brainwashing of all former Monolithians. This could only be achieved from within SIRCAA, where Laboratory X11 and the Monolith installation could be found. This is where things get a bit complicated, because it seems that Faust's plan actually changed during the events of the game. You see, at the beginning, the protagonist, Skiff, was not accounted for in the Monolithians' scheme, simply because Faust had not met him yet. Instead, it looks like S.T.A.L.K.E.R was the one supposed to find a way inside the Institute, which is why he investigated the old underground transport facilities that once connected to X11. Perhaps the original plan was for Faust's men to infiltrate SIRCAA via this route and launch the Monolith installation from there. However, S.T.A.L.K.E.R did not succeed and was eventually eliminated by Skiff. but we'll get there a bit later. Thankfully for Faust, SIRCAA was planning to restart the X network no matter what, by using an alpha artifact. Long story short, the Institute was desperate to get their hands on the alpha, because it could be used in Lab X11 in order to establish a remote connection to the generators. You can learn more details about this plot point by watching my previous lore video on the scanners. Anyway, Faust heard about this and decided to use the opportunity to sabotage the experiment, so that instead of restoring the link to the generators, it would actually restart the Monolith brainwashing. He was aware of the whole scanner business set up by Herman and Nestor, the true purpose of which being to find and recharge a spent alpha artifact. Not only were the scanners fitted with tracking devices that allowed Faust's men to easily locate them, but Herman also made a deal with the Monolithian. In PDA entries left in the game files, we discover that Herman asked Faust to kill Skiff and recover his scanner. In exchange, he would be given access to the Monolith database. Due to the fact that Noontiders rarely left their island, Faust hired the famous guide Nimble to lead his men, and Foma's squad carried out the hit on Skiff at the old bridge, leaving him for dead and stealing the scanner containing the recharged alpha artifact. While Herman did remotely unlock the Monolith database for Faust, the latter never intended to bring the scientist his scanner, and instead kept it for himself. Unfortunately, we don't know what the Monolith database is exactly, although it is clear that its content helped Faust in his quest. With the alpha secured, it was time for Faust to make everything fall into place. He orchestrated an explosion at Wild Island, triggered by a scanner activated by Foma. It is also implied Faust was responsible for the debacle at the waste processing station, where a controller showed up and obliterated a large group of Noonstalkers. These events helped Faust get rid of some Noontiders who were gathering evidence of his activities, while also pushing other members of the faction over the edge. Shortly after, Faust had his final argument with Strider, where he held him responsible for slowly killing their brothers with his dangerous work ethics, and accused him of keeping them away from happiness and their true purpose. Faust did not need Strider's hospitality any longer, so he gathered as many followers as possible and they left Wild Island for good. To make sure that SIRCAA's experiment at X11 would fail, Faust sent Foma's team to tamper with the equipment at Azimuth Station. It is implied that S.T.A.L.K.E.R was the one who facilitated the Monolithians' attack on the Warden base. While they succeeded in sabotaging the station, with consequences we will discuss a bit later, Foma failed to eliminate Skiff and perished himself. That's where Skiff discovered that Faust had a spy within the Warden ranks, and went after S.T.A.L.K.E.R, eventually killing him as well. Meanwhile, Faust headed to the forgotten Clear Sky base hidden deep within the swamps. The way to the base had been covered by Psi-emitters a long time ago, yet this did not pose any problems for the voice of the Monolith, who somehow easily bypassed the security systems and safely reached the ruins. The same could not be said for the rest of his men though, which is also why they hired Nimble to guide them there. As a former Clear Sky member, he knew how to navigate the area, but after seeing that Faust's men were killing all witnesses to their actions, Nimble had a change of heart and refused to guide the Monolithians into the swamps. He did, however, send them the map so that they could find their way without him. It is interesting to notice that Faust used an intermediary called S.T.A.L.K.E.R in order to communicate with Nimble. You may remember that S.T.A.L.K.E.R was part of Strider's original squad back in Call of Pripyat. However, Nimble addresses S.T.A.L.K.E.R as if he was talking directly with Faust, assuming the name is just a cover or that S.T.A.L.K.E.R is being completely controlled by the blind man. Anyway, Faust brought the stolen scanners to the Clear Sky base, where they were all dismantled except for the one containing the Alpha. When Skiff caught up to him, we witnessed an interesting cutscene that deserves a deeper analysis. The reason Faust came to this place was to use the Visiograph, a device of Project X able to display subtle images from the noosphere. It is implied that all Visiographs are connected to the X network, and therefore should not be able to function without the network being online. However, we can see that Faust plugged the device to the scanner containing the Alpha artifact. The cable is clearly visible both during and after the cutscene. Since the Alpha is a source of power for the installations of the X network, I assume it was enough to turn on the Visiograph, even if isolated from the rest of the network. Moreover, Faust owns a special key that unlocks Visiographs, in the form of a necklace. In this scene, the pendant is not around his neck, because he had to insert it on the control panel, where the intended spot can be seen. It is unknown how the Monolithian came to acquire this object, or even how it was created, but it was of significance for him considering he wore it at all times. Nevertheless, Faust used the Visiograph to take a look at his Monolithian brothers and their fates. Most of them were already deceased, with Faust stating the cause of death, but a few were still alive, including Strider, who is displayed at the end. It is possible that all this information comes from the so-called Monolith database that Herman had previously unlocked for Faust, but we don't know for sure. According to his own words, Faust is doing this in order to say goodbye to his comrades. It seems like he wants to move on, and mentions that after all these years spent without the Monolith, his kind still remains hated by everyone in the zone. To him, bringing the Monolith back is the only way to happiness. Furthermore, I believe it was at this moment Faust realized that getting rid of Skiff was not the move. All he had to do was let the Stalker take the scanner back to SIRCAA, and the Alpha would soon be utilized to restart the X network. So that's exactly what he did. Now, I'm sure you've noticed that during the entire sequence, the screen of the Topaz displays a unique blue icon stating "Uploading", a detail that leaves a lot of unanswered questions. Is the scanner uploading something into the Visiograph? Or is it the other way around and the Visiograph is uploading something into the scanner? What is being uploaded anyway? One possibility is that Faust was simply transferring the Monolith database to the Visiograph so that he could read it. Another theory claims that some sort of virus was being put inside the Alpha artifact, which would result in the upcoming failure of the X11 experiment. Truth be told, I am not sure of what is really going on there, so make sure to share your own thoughts in the comments. Last but not least, the scene ends with Faust slamming down the scanner, disorienting Skiff and allowing his escape. However, when our protagonist recovers, we can see that the scanner is still standing there and in good condition, which implies that Faust's gesture was only an illusion. With that in mind, we can wonder how much of this entire scene was actually real. Moving on, there are two things we need to mention before talking about the X11 experiment. The first thing is that Dalin tested the Alpha artifact on the Monolith installation in order to make sure it was genuine. We could have imagined that this would be the experiment to turn into a disaster, but no, everything went fine. Well, almost everything. The Monolith was used in its minimal configuration and only had an effect on Skiff. The Psi hallucinations turned him violent, resulting in Captain Zotov's wound, but apart from that, nothing bad occurred. The second thing is that Faust's men had set up emitters in key positions around the zone, so that when the X network emits the signal, it would be transmitted properly to as many former Monolithians as possible. For instance, a device was hidden underneath a wild island in order to convert all the Noontiders who had decided to stay with Strider. Another emitter was placed inside the sphere, on the orders of its commander and Monolithian spy, Captain Sukin. Now let's take a detailed look at what happened in X11. I know this is supposed to be a video about Faust, but I could not pass an opportunity to dive into this topic. Besides, I can already imagine the comments asking me about how the signal happened, so I hope you can forgive me for the side tangent we are going to take. Firstly, we can picture how Dallin intended the procedure to go. The podium in X11 was specifically built for an alpha during the times of Project X, as a backup control center for the generators. The map of the X network shows that the remote connection was to be handled by going through 2 points of interest, Azimuth Station and S.T.A.L.K.E.R at the unfinished Reactor 5. By the way, this map is incomplete, as we know about other nodes of the X network that are not represented here. Nevertheless, the SIRCAA operators had control over Azimuth and S.T.A.L.K.E.R, most likely via some sort of remote connection, since it looks like they were not physically there. Indeed, the wardens at Azimuth were destroyed by Foma's steam, and as for S.T.A.L.K.E.R, it is supposed to be located inside the Red Fortress, which I doubt was occupied at the time. In any case, once the connection to the generators would be established, SIRCAA planned to seize the anomalous energy, make the zone disappear, and complete Project X by handing control of the noosphere over to Agatha.
Minimizing alpha Psi levels.
0 coulomb on the Kniazinski scale.
Alpha Psi is the Psi radiation of biological nature. I believe the supervisor's comment means an absence of Alpha Psi. According to my research, the Kniazinski scale does not really exist, and is instead a reference to Alexander Kniazinski, a legendary Soviet cinematographer who worked on the film S.T.A.L.K.E.R by Andrei Tarkovsky. The Coulomb, however, does exist, as the unit of electric charge from the International System of Units. This implies that Psi levels can be measured by their electric charge, which is quite weird, to be honest.
Stabilizing bed up Psi.
Resonance eliminated.
Beta Psi is the Psi radiation of electromagnetic nature. Unlike with Alpha Psi, Dallin does not ask to reduce Beta Psi but to stabilize it instead, which is achieved by removing the resonance of the electromagnetic wave. I think it means that they will use Beta Psi to handle the connection to the X network, something that makes perfect sense considering almost all of the installations from Project X work that way.
Scanning for Tau presence.
Done. Non-detected.
We learned later in the game that phantoms and other induced illusions are created via Psi emissions within the Tau range. Here, Dallin is making sure that no undesirable Psi interference remains.
Performing visual analysis. No damage detected.
I suppose any damage to the artifact could jeopardize the experiment. This is the reason the Alpha needed to remain inside the scanner until it got to SIRCAA, and why Dallin convinced Korshunov not to attack Wild Island head-on. If any alterations were made to the artifact by Faust at Clear Sky, they went unnoticed.
Azimuth. Router ready.
A router is a device that handles the transmission of data. Azimuth was also where Skiff accessed the Monolithian PDA network based on anomalous electromagnetic waves, so it makes sense for the station's role to be the router. Notice that Azimuth is a 3-point, being linked with another branch of the network that goes all the way to the Duga through the sphere and orbita. Faust's sabotage of the station aimed at redirecting the router towards this other part of the network instead of the generators, as we will see a bit later.
Block 5.
Waveguide ready.
Block 5 obviously refers to the unfinished Reactor 5 of the power plant, now known as the Red Fortress. A waveguide is a system aimed at guiding electromagnetic waves in order to keep them confined to a certain environment. This helps to propagate the signal and deliver it where it is supposed to go. Unfortunately, the interior of the Red Fortress cannot be accessed in-game, so we don't really know about the Project X installations located there.
S.T.A.L.K.E.R.
Gateway open. X11. Awaiting connection.
According to the map, S.T.A.L.K.E.R is also inside the Red Fortress, so I am not sure why Block 5 and S.T.A.L.K.E.R are considered two different things here. Perhaps two separate operators are needed to control everything. Regardless, S.T.A.L.K.E.R seems to be the gateway to the generators, and as such will handle all the remaining steps from the experiment. There is a theory that S.T.A.L.K.E.R is like a supercomputer for the X network, but I guess we will find out for sure if the location gets added in the future. Not if, but when. At least I hope so.
Connection!
Biaxial array.
Yes, sir.
Potentials.
Nominal.
Well, everything seems to be in order. We can proceed.
Synchronize!
Time out of sync phase detected.
Yes, I was right, I knew it!
Dalin's comment refers to the fact that the Alpha artifact is indeed genuine and successfully connected to the X network, a fact that is attested by the presence of Kaimanov's sync phase. I imagine that it represents a specific set of synchronization parameters for the Psi signal, which is required for the installations from Project X to work properly. Well, here goes. At this moment we can see on the map that the connection to S.T.A.L.K.E.R and the generators was lost. Instead, the router to Azimuth redirected the signal towards the other branch of the X network, with the sphere, orbita and the Duga. This was the purpose of Faust's sabotage at Azimuth. According to Dalin's analysis after the disaster, this triggered a defense protocol that restarted the Monolith brainwashing program. As a result, not only did the X network come back online, at least partially, but the so-called signal was emitted. As explained by Professor Lodochka, the Psi emitters installed earlier by Faust are devices that receive this signal and transmit it on a Psi frequency that no Monolithian can resist. All the former fanatics who found themselves unprotected from the emissions returned to their controlled state, supposedly regardless of the status of the Monolith installation. It should also be mentioned that the signal was not continuous, but a temporary spike in Psi activity that only lasted for a short time. This is evident from the fact that Monolithians who found themselves shielded from the Psi emissions at the moment of the signal were able to escape the reboot of their brainwashing, Spirit being one of them. Following the signal, the zone erupted into chaos. It turned out that a lot of Monolithians were out there, way more than anyone could have anticipated. It was not just noontide, but also all those who had hidden elsewhere in the zone, be it among themselves or within stalker communities. With the brainwashing restarted, they immediately dug out their Monolith gear and attacked key locations such as the Sphere, Zalesia, Slag Heap, the Commissary, and of course, SIRCAA itself. The sabotaging of X11 went beyond emitting the signal, as the core of the lab exploded and the Institute's almost perfect protection systems failed. Anomalies and mutants poured inside while the fanatics massacred wardens and scientists alike. Strider, who succumbed to the signal at X11, not before attempting to shoot himself, mind you, took the Alpha artifact to bring it to Faust. The Preacher had succeeded in bringing the Monolith back, but his plan was far from over. It was time for him to move on to Phase 2. Indeed, the voice of the Monolith immediately took control of a large group and headed for the Duga. They eventually destroyed the IPSF garrison and established a foothold at the smaller part of the array. According to Dalin, the Duga can be used to amplify Psi radiation, and thus could become some sort of new brain scorcher capable of destroying the Psi-Immunity of all stalkers within the zone. Supposedly, this would allow Faust to turn everyone into Monolithians. Yet, this is not what happened. You see, the whole system was designed so that Duga could only be launched into its Psi radiation mode from Malachite, via a connection to the Promin factory. As far as I understand, the Duga itself is not the source of the Psi emissions, but instead will amplify the Psi signal created by an emitter meant to be located in the lab underneath Promin. S.T.A.L.K.E.R and his Spark troops fitted Promin with the Psi emitter and convinced Professor Ozerski, the director of Malachite, to activate the antennas. This bloodthirsty plan was aimed at crushing the Ward's initial attack on the Monolithian positions by zombifying the poor soldiers. This absolutely worked, and Faust had nothing to do with it. Everything was S.T.A.L.K.E.'s doing. He had intended to shut down the Lesser Duga after this surprise, but he couldn't, as there was one thing that the Sparkers had not accounted for. Faust's followers managed to obtain the control codes for the emitter, meaning they were now piloting the installation. While Skiff was looking for a way to defeat the Preacher, Faust resumed these preparations. His men invested the comms center, setting up defenses and raising Psi antennas on the rooftop. The building was not chosen randomly. It contained a special control room with a receptacle for the Alpha artifact, which was eventually brought by Strider. The exact purpose of this contraption remains unclear, though my theory is that using the Alpha allowed to bypass the aforementioned Promin system. Basically, I think that the Duga could be turned into its own self-sufficient Psi emitter thanks to the power of the artifact. This would explain why Faust did not simply zombify the whole zone from the get-go, as he needed more time to fine-tune the installation and, most importantly, wait for the Alpha to arrive. This delay gave Skiff the necessary time to uncover Faust's true nature from X5, and install a suppressor device that would allow protection from the controller's phantom Psi abilities. This precious time was also used by Skiff's allies to prepare their second attack on the Duga. In the end, the timing of Faust's plan would be his demise, as his enemies managed to blow up the antennas before he could launch the signal. Skiff confronted him in an epic showdown on the comms center's rooftop, ultimately beating down the voice of the Monolith. During the boss fight, we can notice that Faust heavily relies on Psi devices in order to generate his induced illusions. Indeed, the player needs to destroy the small emitters scattered on the roof, then shoot at the Psi inductor on Faust's hip. This suggests that the Monolithians' Psi powers are limited when not being boosted by additional emitters, and we can imagine that the suppressor installed in S.T.A.L.K.E.'s helmet would have been enough to negate the phantoms if Faust had not prepared the battleground beforehand. Nevertheless, the voice of the Monolith was defeated, but not before sending S.T.A.L.K.E. into the subtle world for one final conversation. The subtle world remains unexplained for the most part, though I understand it as a specific layer of the noosphere that can only be accessed via an extremely advanced connection to the informational field. It is easy to make the assumption that the subtle world is just another induced illusion, but the fact is that what happens in the subtle world can have consequences in our physical world. For example, if Skiff doesn't climb himself, Faust will drop him to his death. A fall in the subtle world, but a very real death. Also, Faust seems to have some control over what he shows Skiff in this realm, as demonstrated by his ability to quickly change the time of day. Furthermore, I believe the fact that he has pupils instead of his usual blank eyes signifies his aptitude to see clearly inside the subtle world, allowing for so-called miracles like finding his way to the Clear Sky base on his own. In the cutscene, Faust refers to Skiff as the envoy of the Monolith, explaining that from his point of view, the Stalker carried out the will of the Monolith. Indeed, Skiff was the one who brought the Alpha artifact into the zone, recharged it, then delivered it to SIRCAA, allowing for the Monolithians to make a comeback. What's more, Faust believes he actually did something wrong that angered the Monolith, and that is why Skiff came to stop him, as punishment for his mistake. He does not reveal the nature of his wrongdoing, but it is speculated that his attempt to take over the Duga and brainwash the entire zone could be the misstep that he is referring to. In fact, Faust goes on to reveal he had decided that all stalkers deserved to feel the joy of serving the Monolith, not just the chosen few Monolithians, which seems to confirm that his plan was to turn all people in the zone into fanatics. According to him, standing in the light of the Monolith is the only path to true happiness, something he understood after losing his eyesight but gaining his controller abilities. In order to illustrate his words, Faust alters the subtle world so that Skiff can see it in the same way that he does. In my opinion, what we witness here is the network of synapses within the zone. That is, the elements that constitute the noosphere, which came crashing down onto the Earth following the zone's birth. We notice that they are arranged like some sort of large web that forms the psi energy of the informational field. Moreover, living beings with cognitive abilities like Skiff and Faust are full of synapses, while the most important parts of the X network are focal points for huge psi concentrations, the most striking one being, of course, the center of the zone. All in all, interpreting the exact meaning of Faust's speeches is rather difficult, and I've seen multiple possible explanations, so I'm not going to attempt any further analysis for the time being. I'm sure you can make your own opinion on the matter. Following their preacher's demise, the surviving Monolithians scattered and left the Duga, retreating towards the northern parts of the zone like Pripyat and the Red Fortress. Faust might be gone, but his ideals remained, carried by the loudspeakers still broadcasting his words. The Monolith faction had lost a battle but not the war, and the remaining fanatics would continue to terrorize the zone for a while. As for Skiff, he was able to recover Faust's pendant as well as his PDA, tools that were to unlock the story further. Overall, Faust turned out to be pretty much like we imagined from the trailers, a Noontider obsessed with bringing back the Monolith and... Hold on. What do you mean it's not over? Oh, Oh no. Ah, damn it. Well, I'm sorry, but this video is long enough already. Besides, Faust's involvement in Project Y is a whole other topic. However, I promise we will discuss it in the next video. I hope to see you there, and until then, good hunting, stalkers.